What if I told you that in the last 3 years, young people, people your age, or maybe just a few years older, physically removed sitting governments from power? Not through elections, not through social media petitions, not through hashtags that trend for 48 hours and disappear. I mean, they actually walked into the streets, refused to leave, and forced presidents and prime ministers to resign or flee the country entirely. And you probably heard almost nothing about it. Not because it didn't happen, it absolutely did, but because the story being pushed to your feed right now, the algorithm, the news cycle, the financial media, they're not built to show you what young people are actually capable of when they realize the system has stopped working for them. Here's what's wild, though. Every single one of these movements, and we're talking Nepal, Bangladesh, Kenya, Senegal, Sri Lanka, every single one started with the same trigger. Not some deep ideological revolution, not a military coup. Young people looked at the economic math of their lives, decided it was completely broken, and said no more. And that should stop you cold, because the math they were staring at, it looks a lot like the math staring back at you right now. So today, we're going to walk through these protests, what actually happened, who led them, and what the financial system those young people were dismantling actually looked like. Because there's a lesson buried inside each one of these stories that the mainstream conversation is completely ignoring. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why these movements are spreading, why they matter to your financial future, and what they're really telling us about the global economy young people are inheriting. Let's get into it. Quick but important note before we go further. This channel does not condone, support, or glorify violence of any kind. What we are doing here is analyzing historical and recent political events through a financial and economic lens, because understanding why people reach a breaking point is essential to understanding where markets, governments, and economies are heading. That's the conversation. Now, let's get back to it. Let's start with the most recent, and honestly, the one that should be dominating every financial and political conversation right now. Nepal, September 2025, just months ago. Nepal is a country of 30 million people tucked between India and China, where over half the population is under 30 years old. Youth unemployment was sitting above 17% officially, and anyone who understands how unemployment figures are constructed knows the real number is almost certainly worse. $1 in $3 flowing through Nepal's entire economy comes not from domestic industry or government investment, but from remittances, money sent home by Nepalis who had to leave the country just to find economic opportunity. Let that sink in. The economic plan for an entire generation was essentially leave. So the frustration was already boiling. Then, on September 4, 2025, the government of Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli did something that felt to Nepal's young people like a direct declaration of war. They banned 26 social media platforms: Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, X, Signal, even LinkedIn, citing a failure by these platforms to register under new government regulations. But here's the thing, critics weren't buying it, because those same regulations included a new digital services tax. And the timing, right as online dissent about corruption and unemployment was peaking, made the whole thing look less like regulation and more like censorship. But there was something else underneath all of this that you need to understand to get the full picture. Nepali Gen Z had been watching something that made their blood boil for months. The children of politicians, the so-called Nepo kids, were posting on Instagram about designer handbags, luxury holidays, and lavish lifestyles, while their peers were struggling to eat, find jobs, or afford rent. In 2025 alone, more than 10 separate corruption cases had emerged involving former prime ministers, and senior bureaucrats. The inequality wasn't abstract, it was being photographed and posted online, and everyone was watching. So when the government shut down the platforms where all of this was being documented and discussed, young people didn't go quiet, they went to the streets. On September 8th, tens of thousands of students, many of them in school uniforms, gathered peacefully at Tigar Mandala in central Kathmandu and marched toward the federal parliament building. The government's response was catastrophic. Armed police fired into the crowds. 19 people were killed that single day, including a 12-year-old child. A Harvard University forensic analysis later confirmed that nearly all gunshot victims were struck above the waist, in the head, neck, and chest, a direct violation of international crowd control protocols. Police logs showed that 2,642 live rounds were fired over just 2 days. The movement exploded. Within 48 hours, Nepal's parliament building was in flames. The Supreme Court was set on fire. The headquarters of the 3 major political parties were torched. A former prime minister was beaten inside his own home before it too was burned down. Protesters stormed the Singha Durbar, the sprawling palace complex housing Nepal's government ministries, and stood on its roof waving the Nepali flag, in scenes that looked almost identical to what had happened in Sri Lanka 3 years earlier. On September 9th, Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli resigned. A government dismantled in under 48 hours. On September 12th, Sushila Karki, a former Chief Justice, was appointed as Nepal's first ever female Prime Minister. The House of Representatives was dissolved. Elections were scheduled for March 2026. 76 people were dead, more than 2,000 injured. Now here's the financial thread I want you to lock in on. Nepal's economic model had failed its young people so completely that the only viable path forward was emigration. The country had essentially outsourced its youth employment to other nations and called it an economy. When the government then tried to shut down the one digital space where young people were organizing, building alternate income, and documenting elite corruption, that was the last straw. The social media ban wasn't just censorship, it was an economic threat. Because for many Nepali young people, those platforms were their marketplace, their newsroom, and their community all at once. You cannot cut people off from the only economic oxygen they have left and expect them to stay silent. Let's move to Bangladesh, July 2024, a country of 170 million people where over 60% of the population is under 35 years old. The Bangladesh government had reinstated a quota system for civil service jobs, a policy that reserved a large percentage of government positions for descendants of freedom fighters from the 1971 war. Now here's the economic reality underneath that policy. In Bangladesh, a government job isn't just a paycheck, it's stability, healthcare, pension, and social status in an economy where private sector opportunity is deeply unequal. So when young graduates who had spent years studying, accumulating credentials, doing everything right, found out that the best jobs were being handed out based on bloodline rather than merit, something snapped. University students started protesting. The government's response was forceful, and what happened next surprised almost everyone watching. Within weeks, the protests had swelled from thousands to what independent observers estimated as millions. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who had been in power for 15 consecutive years, one of the longest-serving female heads of government in the world, resigned and fled the country by helicopter. 15 years of political power dismantled in weeks by students. Now here's the economic thread running through this. Bangladesh's economy had been growing impressively on paper. GDP numbers looked good, garment exports were booming, but the growth wasn't reaching young people. Graduate unemployment was rising, the credential system wasn't delivering the outcomes it promised. Young people had done what they were told: study hard, get a degree, compete, and found the doors were locked by a quota system built for someone else's generation. Sound familiar? Let's move to Kenya. Same year, 2024, different country, same economic undertone. The Kenyan government, facing serious debt pressure, and Kenya's debt-to-GDP ratio had climbed to levels that were genuinely alarming, introduced a finance bill with a package of new taxes. Taxes on bread, taxes on cooking oil, taxes on sanitary products, taxes on digital content creators. That last one matters, because Kenya has one of the most vibrant creator economies in Africa. Young Kenyans had pivoted away from the traditional employment path, which wasn't delivering, and built income through YouTube, TikTok, freelancing, and digital entrepreneurship. And the government came for that, too. Gen Z in Kenya, many of whom had never participated in formal politics organized primarily through TikTok and X. They stormed the Parliament building. Several protesters were killed, but the movement held. President William Ruto, who had campaigned specifically on a pro-youth, anti-establishment platform just 2 years earlier, withdrew the finance bill entirely, a complete policy reversal from the sitting government. Think about that for a second. The Kenyan government backed down, not because of opposition parties, not because of foreign pressure, because young people who built their financial lives outside the traditional system refused to let that system tax away their alternative. The economic story here is really about what happens when a government, desperate for revenue because of debt obligations largely inherited from previous administrations, tries to close the one valve that young people found to breathe through. Senegal, 2024 again, and it's worth noting just how concentrated this timeline is. These aren't scattered incidents across decades. This is a pattern happening in real time. In Senegal, the trigger was President Macky Sall announcing he would delay the presidential election, an election he was constitutionally barred from running in anyway. For young Senegalese, this wasn't just a political betrayal, it was an economic one. Senegal was on the edge of major offshore oil and gas production coming online. The distribution of that resource wealth was tied directly to who held power and what deals had been made. Young Senegalese took to the streets. The internet was shut down, opposition leaders were arrested, and yet the movement didn't collapse. Sall reversed course. The elections were held, and a 44-year-old opposition candidate, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who had literally been released from prison just days before the election, won the presidency. The youngest elected president in Senegalese history, elected by a youth population that refused to let resource wealth get locked into the hands of a political class that had been there since before they were born. The financial subtext? Natural resource revenues in developing economies have a brutal history of enriching elites while youth unemployment stays high. These young people understood that the election was the economic policy. Now let's go back just slightly. Sri Lanka in 2022, because this one might be the most visually striking of all. Sri Lanka experienced a near-total economic collapse. Foreign exchange reserves ran out. The country couldn't import fuel, medicine, or cooking gas. People waited in lines for days. Inflation hit 70% at its peak. And the Rajapaksa family, who had dominated Sri Lankan politics for nearly 2 decades, had implemented a series of economic decisions that many economists described as catastrophically reckless. Overnight banning of chemical fertilizers that devastated crop yields, massive tax cuts that collapsed government revenue, then borrowing to cover the gap until the borrowing itself became unsustainable. Young Sri Lankans stormed the presidential palace. Not symbolically, they literally swam in the president's pool, cooked in his kitchen, and slept in his bedroom. The images went around the world. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled to the Maldives and later Singapore before formally resigning. The lesson here is about what happens at the absolute end of the line, when economic mismanagement becomes so severe that the social contract isn't just strained, it's shredded. Young people in Sri Lanka weren't protesting ideology, they were protesting the inability to eat. So here's what connects all 5 of these stories, and why I think this matters enormously to how you think about your own financial life. Every single one of these movements was driven by young people who had followed the rules, studied, competed, credentialed, tried to build within the system, and found that the system had changed the turns on them without notice. The quota system in Bangladesh changed the terms. The tax structure in Kenya changed the terms. The delayed election in Senegal changed the terms on resource wealth. The economic collapse in Sri Lanka changed every term there was. And in Nepal, the government didn't just change the terms, they tried to cut off the internet and pretend that young people had no other options. And here's what the mainstream financial conversation misses every single time it discusses these events as purely political stories. They are fundamentally economic stories about what happens when a generation can't find a viable path forward within the existing structure. The young people in these countries didn't just change governments, they sent a signal. A signal that the credential economy, the idea that if you just follow the approved path, do the approved things, the system will reward you, that signal is losing its credibility globally. And it's losing it fastest among the most educated, most connected, most economically aware generation in human history. That's Gen Z, and they are paying attention, not just in Kathmandu, Dhaka, and Nairobi, but in New York, London, Lagos, and everywhere in between. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these governments were all the same, or that every protest had the same outcome, or that what worked in Kathmandu is a blueprint for everywhere else. What I am saying is this. When you zoom out and look at all 5 of these events together, you're watching a generation do a very clear-eyed economic calculation and reject the answer. The calculation goes like this. Work within the system, follow the approved path, absorb the debt, accept the terms, wait your turn. And the output of that calculation, for millions of young people across multiple continents, keeps coming back negative. The math doesn't work. The market has moved. The old promises are not being kept. And here's the part that should hit closest to home. The same frustration that drove young people into the streets in Kathmandu is driving young people to build businesses entirely outside the traditional system in cities all over the world. The same disillusionment pushing graduates in Nairobi to bet on their TikTok account over a government job is pushing graduates everywhere to bet on freelancing over a corporate ladder that no longer goes as high as it used to be. The shape of the frustration is identical, only the outlet is different. So here's what I want you to take from this. Stop waiting for the system to fix itself in your favor, because history now shows us on 5 different continents that it won't, not until it absolutely has to. Start building proof of what you can do outside the credentialing machine. Stop preparing for a future that was designed for someone else's economy and start capturing value in the present economy as it actually exists today. Stop asking the old gatekeepers for permission to be taken seriously and start demonstrating through your work, your output, your results that you already are. The opportunity here is massive for the people who see this shift clearly, but the window is closing fast for those still clinging to a model that 5 continents worth of young people are actively walking away from. The question isn't whether you understand the system. The question is, are you building something real, something someone will pay for right now, today, in this economy? That's the game that matters anymore. And now you know exactly why. If this has made you see the world and your place in it in a completely different way, do me a favor, hit subscribe, turn on notifications right now, and share this with someone who still thinks the old rules are going to protect them. See you in the next one.